Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our session today on how UBI improves mental health. My name is Monika Viktorova. I'm one of NABIG's organizers, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to give a brief overview on how to use Crowdcast. If you'd like to submit a question to the speakers, please post it in the Ask a Question section down below. You may also vote on questions already posted by other attendees. This is going to help us determine which questions to prioritize. Next, there's a chat box where you can hold side conversations. This is where we're going to be posting links and supplemental information from the speakers during our conversation today. In order to keep things moving, we might not be able to get to responding to all the activity in the chat, so please be sure to submit any questions using the Ask a Question function. I'd like to give a really warm welcome to our panel speakers today and introduce them. Adrian Comeau is a registered social worker in Ontario, supporting individuals, families, and communities experiencing concerns with mental health, addictions, and navigating systems. Adrian has been involved with Basic Income London as a member and co-chair, supporting events in the London community. Adrian believes that basic guaranteed income is critical to bringing equity and autonomy to individuals and communities facing mental health challenges. Adrian's excited to connect with passionate members of the Basic Guaranteed Income community in order to develop, brainstorm, and engage in shifting the social assistance system to better enhance our society. Leslie E. Couch has been a North Carolina licensed clinical mental health counselor since 1994. For the first half of her career, she provided counseling and victim advocacy for crime victims, primarily in cases of domestic violence and sexual assault. Currently, she's in private practice, specializing in helping adolescent and adult females take more proactive approaches to their lives. As a fourth-degree black belt in the Japanese martial art of Aikido, she often incorporates movement and physical activity to help women get a more physical sense of being powerful and taking initiative in their own lives. Matthew Smith is a professor of health history at the University of Strathclyde Center for the Social History of Health and Healthcare. He has written about the history of ADHD, food allergy, deinstitutionalization, and is currently writing a book on the history of social psychiatry in the US. So today's discussion is going to be a panel discussion. We know that a wealth of social science research has shown that there is a correlation between poverty and mental health, where struggling to meet basic needs also coincides with depression and other mental health conditions. There's also plenty of data indicating that there's a causal relationship, where alleviating poverty almost instantly decreases mental health symptoms dramatically. And as a result, universal basic income is a particularly attractive policy option for decreasing mental health issues. So today's panel speakers are going to explore how UBI can be used to improve mental health. So without further ado, I want to jump into our first question, and anyone from the panel, please feel free to respond. What is the relationship between poverty and mental health?
Well, it's a fairly straight line. I mean, it's not the only part of the line, but the research is so clear, even independent of UBI pilots. If you alleviate poverty, mental health symptoms fall off a cliff kind of quickly.
I'll jump in if I might. So if we go back a long ways, in terms of how mental health problems have tried to be explained, we can see that poverty has been linked with mental health problems going right back to the start of the 20th century. And the problem has been figuring out what to do about that.
Adrian, I think you're on mute. Let me just unmute you here.
Oh, unusual. Is that better? Perfect. There we go. Thank you. I was just thinking, one thing to add regarding mental health, and as Leslie and Matt have said, the research and how it's sort of historically been viewed has made it pretty clear. But in working with families and community members who are experiencing mental health concerns, one thing that our current system of welfare, for example, here in Ontario, and poverty alleviation does is kind of, over time strip the dignity away from individuals through like application processes, validating they're so ill for example, for disability supports, et cetera, right? So, not just the experience of poverty and the stressors and the trauma that can come from that add to the mental health concerns, but then the system of getting support is so backlogged and inefficient that it just sort of breeds stigmatization and adds on to the concerns as well, right? So I think it's a double-edged sword there in terms of the issues of poverty themselves and the sort of the corresponding factors, and then getting help is very challenging depending on, I think, where you live, but very much depending where you live here in Ontario, it's very challenging.
Also, it sort of sets up forced dependency. So, like, I worked a lot with domestic violence victims and still do. And, I cannot tell you what it does to me to have to, help sort through the situation and then tell somebody, well, you don't have access to the family money. You don't even have access to information about the family money. You don't own anything. He keeps your credit card maxed out. Like, you don't have any way, you have nowhere to go. You can't leave. I mean, I never make that decision for my clients, but it's not that hard to connect those dots. This would change everything.
That's really, really powerful. Thank you, Leslie and Adrian and Matt, for kind of setting that context there. Yesterday's discussions actually focused a little bit on that. I don't know if anyone saw our keynote, but the organization Free From, the representative actually spoke a little bit about how challenging it is for survivors of domestic violence to leave, especially because domestic violence so often coincides with economic violence and with an abuser really removing access to any kind of money from their victim, and then trapping them in that cycle, because of course you can't leave if you don't have any money to do so. Mm-hmm. And so maybe the question that I'll jump into next is to ask the panel, what do you see as the promise of universal basic income to start breaking those cycles and helping folks who are experiencing mental health issues as a result of poverty or as a result of domestic violence?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Matt.
Okay. So when I've been looking at the history of social psychiatry, and when that research is sort of summed up, there are 3 or 4 factors that are highlighted. So one is poverty, which is pretty straightforward. The other one is inequality. So it's not just being poor, it's how much of a gap there is between you and others in society. And then the other ones are social isolation and community disintegration. And so basic income addresses many of those things. So obviously it lifts people out of the poverty line, but it also provides a potential to reduce inequality. So people can go back to school. Everyone, if it's universal basic income, everyone gets it. And in terms of social isolation, it allows people to engage in their communities and receive an income, and carers along with that, but also people volunteering and trying to make their community better. So all those things contribute, in my perspective, to focusing on, rather than economic growth, but social and emotional growth within communities. So but that's all coming from research going back a long ways.
I think one of the incredible parts about basic income, that when it comes to alleviating in particular social isolation, and some of the narratives around basic income that are really important to talk openly about is so we've seen in pilots, like we see on Income in Alberta, we see in the Ontario pilot that just was cancelled at the beginning of our new government, which I won't get into too much there, tempted as I am. Is we saw people not just going back to school, which sort of has like an economic advantage to it, if we're thinking of like fiscal conservatism and how we sort of have to work inside those narratives, but a social boon as well, because people can give back into their communities in ways that are meaningful to them, and sometimes that's not work. Sometimes that's not 9 to 5, and it's okay that it's not a 9 to 5. It's okay that it's increased volunteering, active participation in a kid's ecosystem, in school volunteering, for example, or community membership. Like, all that stuff is important and just as valuable to people's wellness. And I think one thing that I just want to add on as well is, in terms of inequality, is I think sometimes when I talk or hear inequality, I think a lot about purchasing power and ability to, like grocery stores, for example, are gated communities in the sense, right? If you don't have an income, you can't go participate in getting food, which is a pretty incredible problem to have. But and in the inequality of a lack of autonomy, I think, is a really important factor as well. And having the ability to have the autonomous nature to go out and live the life as to your value is a really important thing that you don't get to do, if unfortunately as often as you'd like to, if you're experiencing poverty, because you simply just don't have the means to do it. So you're forced to work in jobs you hate, you're forced to engage in relationships you don't like, you're forced to engage in a system that oppresses you, and the lack of autonomy is a really big part of why people experience inequality, because if you don't know what you can have, or you can't access it, then it doesn't matter very much, right? It's just from an anti-oppressive lens. So I think that the dignity and the autonomy is a super critical part of what basic income sort of helps alleviate as well.
And there's a related issue too, which is, if you don't know where your next meal's coming from or where rent is coming from, you can't think. Like, you take such a big cognitive hit. And if you can't think, then it's hard to think your way through what are the situations that will put you in the best, that are sort of best for your mental health, best for your physical health. If literally all you can think about is what am I going to do about rent, all of the rest of it is rendered completely irrelevant, and you literally can't think about it, which just perpetuates this cycle of poverty. It's a trap.
If I could add just one other thing. So the fact about mental illness is that there's so many different factors that contribute to it. And this is one major factor. And if we alleviated it, we'd be able to focus on the really intractable, difficult factors that contribute to mental health problems, whether they be genetic, rooted in childhood sexual abuse, for example, or other sorts of things. So, right now, mental health professionals are dealing with a lot of mental illness that could be seriously eroded. And then they could spend more time dealing with these more intractable situations.
In some ways, I actually am not sure we have a clear conception of what mental illness is, because we've never actually tried to look at it without this piece. And it drastically changes the landscape of what mental illness looks like if you take out poverty and economic stress.
And I know I don't want to jump ahead, because I know there's we've cheated, and I know there's a question coming up about community resources and how their efficiency is working with mental health. But one thing we've seen very aptly is in pilot studies is the reduction of hospitalizations, and we've talked about that a bit already. But when it comes to mental health hospitalizations, I worked in working in frontline mental health, working with early psychosis programs. I got pretty comfortable walking in and out of hospitals with folks who unfortunately had to spend some time in there, and just the system and the navigation of the system that is so has such high justification to strip, that you take the rights away of people in a time sensitive area. We've seen those things kind of go down in pilots. So you've seen people access the hospital left for mental health and crisis services because, funny enough, whether they had a diagnosis of X or Y before, what they didn't have is the ability to go and, provide for themselves and have that dignity and that ability to navigate their own world. And so that adds stress, and that can add to, getting a diagnosis. So I think the tricky part is we have here when it comes to how sort of things currently sort of work out is without the ability to access the resources and without the means to access the resources, not so much the ability, but the means to do so, as you're left playing in a system that often can stigmatize you as worse than or less than, or as broken in some capacity or needing to be fixed. When in actuality, if you felt you have the autonomy to sort of engage in your own change in the way that is meaningful to you, you probably wouldn't need to access some of those emergency services in the first place. And we've research has shown that like clear as day in numerous pilot studies regarding mental health and hospitalizations. So, yeah.
Some really, really powerful points there. And I want to bring in a question from the audience on this, because we're talking about the stress that poverty creates and how it can create these mental health problems. And the question that comes from Sid is, how significant is the stress from surveillance and control that's involved in social assistance programs in generating and maintaining mental health problems for recipients?
Do you mind if I take this one first, Leslie? Is
Go.
that okay? I read the question. And I almost wanted to ask if I could answer it beforehand, because this is really what kind of got my blood going when I first started learning about UBI and community work. It's pretty appalling. I don't have a better way to put it regarding the surveillance that people are forced to, and from tracking every dollar and cent, right, to tracking bank account statements, to being audited every time. And I've seen people who an audit, for example, has totally totaled their ability to participate in life in a meaningful way, because now they don't have their social assistance income anymore. And as little as it was in the scope of living, it was something that they were able to do a little bit with, and now it's totally gone because the state, in a sense, has said, well, you're not sick enough, or you've worked too much, or all that type of intensity of surveillance, right? It adds a lot of fear, a lot of stress of persecution in a way, and a lot of fear of having the rug pulled right under you. And I think I alluded to this earlier, is people are often criticized. We've all probably heard rhetoric of cheating the system, or they're mooching welfare. Whoever thinks that you can mooch $700 a month to live in Ontario is bonkers. I don't understand, but people do have to break the rules of the system, because the rules are awful and garbage anyway. I know as a caseworker, I told people, hey, if your parents are open to helping you out a little bit, don't get them to e-transfer you. I've told parents, send them the grocery gift card, because Ontario Works can't track that. And they don't like that. No one feels good about that. The person on welfare doesn't love that they have to do this, but they also don't love the fact that they can't afford first and last, or rent, ongoing, or food, because of the surveillance they're under. And if they try and work, they get their wages reduced and everything. It's such a punitive system. So that type of consistent stress of persecution and having the rug be able to be pulled under you is so significant, and has a tremendous amount of difficulties to people when it comes to their mental wellness.
I agree. I think the way the social safety net is set up, but also sort of the philanthropy industry, they want to do their pet thing. They want people to have their pet thing. But then sort of back to my point about the cognitive stuff, if I had to show you what money I spent for gas, what money I spent for food, I don't have time to do that. I mean, I could do it. I can think about it, but I don't really have time. It kind of stresses me out to even imagine doing it. And I'm okay financially right now. But if you try to ask somebody who's up against the wall in that way and doesn't have the spare brain cells, that's just cruel.
I think it really creates a feeling amongst people that they're second-class citizens. And it's very demeaning. And it gets back to this idea about poverty that goes right back to the 1832 Poor Law in England, that there are deserving poor and they're non-deserving poor. And you got to weed out the non-deserving poor. That's basically what the system is all about.
Yeah, what a terrifying concept, the idea that one person is more deserving of assistance than another based on what can often be really arbitrary criteria. I wanted to jump into our next question and kind of build on what we've been talking about. Why is UBI better positioned to potentially alleviate mental health issues that are caused by poverty than maybe some other community mental health support, than more social workers maybe, or more psychologists?
I say this as a licensed counselor. This industry is set up for us to keep having jobs. It's not actually set up to help the people that most of us got into the field to be able to help.
if I could add to that, when the community mental health movement emerged in the 1960s, those community mental health centers were all meant to be preventative spaces. They failed because there wasn't the structural support to support the preventative work. So there were some really interesting things that were done, but the people working there couldn't help the single moms pay for their groceries or ensure they didn't get evicted, all the rest of those things. So you need the basic structural changes in order to build and do the community projects properly.
I think to add to these awesome points too, and I really love Leslie in particular what you said about people are catching on in the chat about protecting jobs. I think what people and what I've had to struggle with in my career and wrestle with is that the social assistance or mental health agency and not-for-profit system is a very combative system because it still plays under the roles of capitalism. And I won't go on my big anti-capitalist rant like fully, but I get the basis of it is that there's not enough resources to use a system of like a charity not-for-profit model to solve underlying societal macro level issues. It's just not, you're trying to use one solution like a hammer when you really need like a wrench or a screwdriver, and it's just not allowed to work. And most of the burnout I've seen in my profession as a social worker is that people feel that they're powerless to actually engage in real meaningful change with their clients because they're up against, like, it doesn't feel great as a therapist or a community worker or a social worker or whomever to let a person know, okay, I know you're living in absolute poverty and you don't have a house, but the homeless urgent housing waiting list is still a year for those who are in urgent status for homelessness, right? So I think there's a lot of self-protectionism, as Leslie pointed out. But there's also a lot of, the not-for-profit community agency sector is trying to play the game of capitalism, and we shouldn't anymore. There should be a pretty big spark, I think, of increased social justice and of macro and micro level changes in an advocacy perspective to bring in. I think basic income is one of the structural pillars that can actually solve a lot of the other issues most clients face. And as Susan just asked, are they not competing for a lot of the same funding? That's the problem, is they are all competing for the same pot of funding. Not-for-profits aren't pivoting well enough to a social enterprise model. There's a lot of things that they're not doing. And so you have all these places, barking for the same issues. They're all got the same pot of money. And it's so awfully inefficient. And I think it's time we probably just give the money to the people experiencing the crises in their lives to manage it, because they can we don't need to do that. We don't need to be the arbiters, the protectors. Or as Matt pointed out, we don't need to be the ones saying that they're deserving of help or not deserving of help. They know that they need the help, and if they had the money to do it, they'd probably figure it out. Again, research has shown that very well, that people figure out their lives way better when they have their needs met. We don't need to be there at all. So
they're also, I figured out pretty early that, and this is completely twisted. Like, I don't know, in some ways I don't defend it, and in some ways I will absolutely defend it, that in some ways the best thing that I could do with somebody who is squished up against the wall with the criminal justice system or the social safety net, those systems, is like, sometimes I would have to give them tips on how to behave and seem like a middle-class white person in order to actually be treated well and get what they needed. Insert expletive during the thing. Anyway, I mean, that's twisted, but that's truly the best that I can do for some of my clients. And that's insane.
Yeah, that goes back to what Matt pointed out about having the deserving poor, right? It's needing to seem a certain way in order to seem deserving of assistance. And so I guess maybe just a follow-up question to what Adrian was saying, and anyone from the panel can feel free to answer, but if we do implement a UBI and hopefully alleviate some of these pressures, what do you see maybe as the role in the future of mental health services? If mental health services aren't maybe treating these like very, very acute problems caused by poverty?
Yeah, so I actually think that's an awesome follow-up question, right? Because it's a real question, what if? And I've always talked about I want to be out of a job. I want to like work myself out of not needing to be a social worker anymore, right? That's sort of the dream. But I think one movement that really encapsulates what a shift into mental health services is the peer support movement. And I'm not sure, depending on familiarity where folks live, both us as panelists in the chat are, but peer support and peer workers as a movement has exploded in the last 5 to 10 years, to the point where agencies that I've worked at are now funding paid peer support workers. Because I think what community mental health agencies need to realize and understand is, yes, there is merit, I think, of course, into like the education and the learned expertise that comes from training, from being licensed and all these things. There is some merit to that, but people who have lived experience with their issues know way better than anyone else about their own lives and the lives of their community most of the time, if not all the time. And so I actually think the future of mental health services is getting out of the way and letting peer support initiatives be driven up and supported in a collaborative front. Like I don't want to I think get into an idea that we have to be totally like wiped out and then peers can come in, or vice versa. I think there's a collaborative movement that can happen, but peer support and the philosophy around peer support, I think, is the future of mental health services, when professionals like us can kind of just get out of the way and let folks live their lives and support each other in the communities that they see fit.
I think that's a really interesting question as well. When Freud described the subconscious and the conscious, he used the metaphor of an iceberg. And I think with mental health, or mental illness, I should say, there's probably there's parallel for that, so that we see all the extreme results of mental health problems, but there's a lot of subtler problems that result from people being very well, I guess, just not being as effective in life as they want to be. So I used to work for the YMCA in Edmonton, Alberta, as a youth career counselor, but all of my job was as a gatekeeper, trying to get these kids money so that they didn't end up on the street. I think they could have benefited enormously from some career counseling, and so that they knew what would make them happy in life, but they never got that. So, and as I said before, there's all sorts of other factors that contribute to mental health problems. If you were in the southern United States in, say, 1900, most of the people in the asylums would either be suffering from the third stage of syphilis, or they'd be suffering from pellagra, which is a vitamin deficiency disease caused by not eating niacin, corn-based diets. And I bet there's all sorts of other, we've sorted those problems out mainly, but there's probably all sorts of examples. I mentioned childhood sexual abuse. That's just such a hidden reservoir of mental health problems that we're not even close to we're barely talking about it. So I don't think there'll be any shortage of problems.
Yeah, I agree. And, Enrique posted in the chat about how there will always be mental illness. There will always be a need for, educated professionals, that Adrian kind of talked about as well. But yeah, part of it is we sort of are treating some symptom and completely ignoring this huge wall of causes. UBI would take one of those big causes off so we can actually start to figure out what's happening. What is mental illness? What is it that we're trying to fix by pretending like poverty is not part of it, or sexual abuse is not part of it, or nutrition is not part of it? In some ways, we have never had a situation where we can truly understand what mental illness is, because we're not interested in solving many obvious underlying conditions.
And I think the other factor is that our society is set up so that only certain people are seen as normal. You know, we have this neurodiversity movement, which I think is brilliant. I think it's really important to realize that you don't have to be cookie cutter perfect to contribute to society. And I think that'd be another thing that UBI could really, really contribute to, is just widening the the definition of what is normal, or even throwing that definition out the window.
And I know we're mindful of time, Monika, so I'll make this point quick. But one thing that I think happens when it comes to poverty and its relationship to mental health concerns and mental illness, right, is when people are trapped in poverty, and as some people have talked in the chat, it's a very intentional trapping by systems, by governments, by society in itself, is that they don't get to engage in political or advocacy actions for themselves in the same way because they're too busy trying to live and survive. And so when I think of the future of a landscape with UBI, I think we will start getting some awesome wisdom from other communities that have largely been oppressed and ignored because of the conditions they live in and the inability for them to maybe speak out and engage. And there's some pretty incredible wisdom. There's a documentary I watched about a Northern Indigenous community, for example, and how they handled consistent sexual abuse within their community is by doing healing and accountability within their own community, having CAS, for example, be pushed away from it. But they had this collective wisdom. Now, it'd be awesome if they could share that with other folks. But the trouble is, of course, in some communities, if they don't have the ability to be at the advocacy tables because they're too busy fighting for their lives, then, well, you don't get to kind of participate in the political system. So I think that's a big arc of it, as well as, having people be able to advocate for their own and actually actively participate in the political system to break down other areas of oppression would be a great way to bring more wisdom into the mental health concerns and questions that we have.
I actually, part of the reason why I sort of chose mental health or UBI advocacy for my project, the thing that I sort of want to take on, is because it looks to me, if we could get a UBI, it would release so much capacity. Like, people don't give a crap if a polar bear is struggling if you don't know whether you're going to be able to eat. People don't care what politician is having at another politician if you don't know where rent's coming from. If we can give people like a reasonable floor to stand on, so much mental capacity will be unleashed for people to take on issues, to see bigger pictures, and to take on issues important to them. That's why I chose UBI.
Thank you, Leslie. And I see that we've dropped in the chat Leslie's paper on the written testimony on poverty, mental health, and the need for universal basic income. So if folks are curious, they can also go ahead and read that. So I wanted to bring us, we touched on a couple of these points earlier, especially around how there's potentially a lot of issues that aren't being looked at because we're treating crisis, but we're not looking at, underlying trauma, things like childhood sexual abuse. And I wanted to ask, how can UBI specifically help improve child mental health?
Well, I think the acronym there is ACEs. Adverse childhood experiences. There's a lot of debate about whether this is a valid way to understand mental health problems, but there's less talk about what underlies those ACEs, and that's where UBI would come in. So we know that early childhood experiences are really important, not just for the rest of childhood, but all the way through adulthood as well. And so anything that we can do to improve, children's experiences growing up, reduce stress, ensure that they feel supported, they have attachment to others in their community, that's going to improve matters for them going on in life. And it's just humane. I mean, I think of childhood as, well, we often think of childhood as the means to the ends of a more competitive, prosperous adult. But we need to see childhood as an end in itself. and then we will have better adults, but that's not the point.
I think, sort of going back to some research I referenced earlier, the Great Smoky Mountain study. So it's a longitudinal study, child and adolescent mental health. 25% get a UBI. There's a link in the paper, or a citation in the paper if you're interested. But so in the middle of this, unexpectedly, a quarter of the kids get effectively a UBI. Parental behavior doesn't change, like lots of stuff doesn't change, except that suddenly they're not in poverty. Their mental health symptoms go down, they increase, resilience, and these are especially pronounced for the kids who were at the lowest rungs in terms of economic stability. So that one change shifted things dramatically for that cohort of kids, and that had ripple effects even for people who didn't get the subsidy but who were in that community. I mean, it's a very straight line. Now, that's not the end all. I mean, it wouldn't solve every problem, but it would make the other problems easier to see and easier to solve.
I think one myth I want to challenge a bit too, that we haven't talked about it, like none of the panelists are perpetuating it, but just you often hear the phrase in the political sphere in conversation, like intergenerational poverty, and often what it's used in terms of in a discriminating way against folks who are experiencing poverty is that it's their behavior, it's the culture of poverty, which goes back to a really old paper written in the 90s about that we can teach people to not be in poverty by giving them up the culture of the middle class instead. So it's some pretty awful crap. But the point is that when we look at some research I know that's come out of here in London by a professor at King's University, and they're still developing some of the further research they're doing on it, is that intergenerational poverty is less about the culture of poverty or how parents treat their children in poverty or the experience of the bad parents engaging with their kids, but it's more about the lack of opportunity that poverty places people within their communities. And so people who are born into that are left with the opportunities that they just don't have the same opportunity. And we see this in school systems, that you can look at a high school and elementary school and very clearly see a class system within itself, right? Those who are able to pay to go on trips and those who can't, those who are able to afford to maybe participate in extracurricular activities and those who can't, right? We see this class structure at such a young age form. And so UBI would, again, enable people as young as children to participate more fuller in their communities. And I can't imagine, I don't work with children as this area of specialty, but I can't imagine from what I know that would be a bad thing. If anything, the more they're connected to their communities, the more they're connected to their own growth and their own needs and their own talents that they want to explore. The better off I can only imagine that and I like to have Matt put it too, like, they'll have an easier time as adults, right? I mean, that's sort of a big point as well. Yeah.
It's really important points there, especially around, how alleviating poverty can have this like really just tremendous and also almost instantaneous impact on children as well. I know that yesterday we had a panel on feminism and caring labor. We touched on some of the points around how the labor of caring for children, caring for the elderly is not really recognized by society. We don't remunerate it, and how UBI could potentially recognize that labor and really make it so that parents who want to stay home aren't afraid that the loss of that paycheck might potentially put their whole family out on the street, and how powerful that can be. So I wanted to potentially bring in some audience questions now. This one is from Susan. How large of a role does stigma of both poverty and mental health play in worsening both? And how would UBI help destigmatize both?
So here in the US, the food benefits, food assistance. When you go to the grocery store, you can only get some items. And you have to use a different form. Like, it's obvious to everyone in the checkout line that you're on food assistance. And sometimes cashiers will say, you can't get this with that food. You know what I mean? I mean, it's just, and that's just food. Plus, you know, I don't have to keep track. I don't have to keep receipts, or I don't have special bus passes that are blue because that means you got it for free. We do this in a myriad ways.
Yeah, I think the two things, you know, it's almost a vicious cycle. I mean, the first point, I suppose, is that people that experience significant mental health problems tend to be impoverished, partly because they can't work. And in many jurisdictions, the benefits that they receive are pretty poor. So you have this vicious cycle of, I'm struggling with mental health problems, so I can't get ahead financially. And because I can't get ahead financially, I keep worrying, and that exacerbates my mental health problems. In terms of the stigma, I think it's exactly what Leslie says, but also other factors. Simply that, you know, we've had increasing, or I guess decreasing, stigma of mental illness over the last few years, and I think that's great. But we're only at the level of talking about it. We're not at the level of really doing anything about it. And I think that's where, you know, that's where you go from mental health problems to the poverty problems, the structural problems, you know. And another one is, we haven't mentioned much, but racism, you know, is especially in the United States, but in Canada, you know, our Aboriginal population in particular, you know, there's all these structural factors, and you need a foundation to start dealing with them. And the current welfare system takes you in the wrong direction. You need that foundation of UBI so that you can start working on all these other things.
I think one area, just to touch on what Matt was saying as well, the idea about talking about it, you know, one of the first things that kind of sparked to my mind was the Bell Let's Talk sort of like anti-stigmatization, and they bring in these celebrities. But honestly, to me, that's always sort of felt like a self-fulfilling tokenism on mental health support and awareness. And I don't disagree that it's like other people are, maybe like the average community member is more open to it, but those companies have financial means to do incredible work to alleviate the suffering of poverty and actively choose not to, because they're still participating in capitalism, right? So, you know, I think it's only goes so far. But one part about the stigmatization I alluded to earlier, in Ontario, we have Ontario Works and Ontario Disability, and the disability pays about $400 for an independent one person independent. But you have to prove you're ill enough. So you have to get an evaluation from a medical professional. That professional has to believe you that you're ill enough. That person judges you that you can or cannot work. Your narrative is and you can write your narrative. You get an opportunity to write your narrative. But at the end of the day, I've looked into the process, the ticky boxes that the mental health professional does regarding the scale of impairment or dysfunction. That's the scale that gets you the money or not. It doesn't matter what your narrative is, more so than not. And then if you don't receive it, well, you can appeal it. Well, that's a months and months long process with significant backlog. And then you're still not living out of poverty. You're still experiencing the throes of poverty while also trying to navigate this ability to prove you're ill enough. And I think I can't think of a lot of ways to be more cruel than to try and ask somebody who is significantly struggling with mental health to prove that they are, in such a dehumanizing way, to get the system, the not just that they need, but that they deserve to live, the support they deserve to be able to purchase food and to pay rent and to exist with the basic needs that really shouldn't be in the system anyway as a cost, but they are, right? So I think proving you're ill enough is one of the most like dastardly things that the Ontario system, and I'm sure other systems around the world, do, because it's just I lost for words. I just can't like rationalize the cruelty that comes with that idea that you need to prove that you're ill enough to get basic needs met. That just seems absurd.
In the US, it's similar. If you have a lawyer, you may get disability the first or second time. If you don't, you're going to have to appeal it probably at least 3 times. I mean, so you're talking 2 or 3 years before you may get approved because you can't afford a lawyer. It may still be over a year if you can, but yeah, it's inhuman.
We often tell people, I've heard like all professions, social workers included, say, don't worry, you're not going to get accepted this time, but we have a way that we can appeal this. But like the guarantee, the narrative is you're going to not get the money you need at the beginning. And that's so beyond comprehension in terms of being like humanity and the support of people who are suffering. I'm talking about people suffering from psychosis, like they're experiencing a genetic brain-based illness of legitimate and concerning psychosis. That's not in their wheelhouse to fix in terms of what happened to their brain and all the other factors that we understand about that. So it's just, it's pretty asinine and ridiculous to me. But
thank you for those, really, really powerful points there. I wanted to bring in potentially one last question from the audience, because I see that we're actually just a minute over time here. And this one's an interesting one from Carl. My impression is that the judgmental system we have is the result of a policy compromise between two groups of people. Group one is people who believe if we make the poor prove they're needy, and most will, then everyone will want to help them. And group two is people who think that if no one's truly needy, then you have to make the poor prove it, and they'll have to go get jobs, and that will solve their problems. And the question is, do you think that the political power of the second group is why our system is so punitive?
I'll answer that very briefly by saying that today we had an MP in UK, Andrea Leadsom, say that the coronavirus furlough system was great for some people. They just loved it and they didn't want to go off furlough. And that's the attitude that you're dealing with. She's conservative, by the way.
Regarding the second area, and in terms of this punitive system, I absolutely think this idea that getting a job is again, it's such a narrow-minded focus of contribution to society and contribution to community. And I think the problem with that narrative and why it becomes so punitive is you tell people to go get work, and then the work that you give them is exploitative contract temporary labor. It has no benefits. Often for Ontario Works, if you are making an income, you get your dollar for dollar removed off your assistance. So you have to climb over your assistance to even be eligible, but you're working a temp labor job. So you risk running off assistance, and you'll lose your debt. Like there's all this, like the whole system, will promote this idea that just go get a job. But getting a job oftentimes, because of the work that's available, is significantly worse of a scenario than being on social assistance, because things like medical aren't covered and any temporary labor job. Medications aren't covered, and we have in Ontario, we have some of those protections when folks are on assistance. So I think the rhetoric of just go back to work, show me the well-paying jobs that are offering people benefits and stability that require no training up, and sure, that narrative can fly, but until we live in that system, then that narrative needs to be squashed, because it's absurdist. And it is why it's very punitive. It's as Matt pointed out, there's more than one MP across all parts of the world spouting that type of rhetoric, right? It's not an uncommon trope or idea. So
the other thought that I have is that capitalism and Protestantism developed at the same time. And so fundamental in there is, if you're wealthy, this is evidence that you are living a pious life. So if you're not wealthy, this means you are actually leading a sinful, ungodly life. And because those two came up at the same time, they are so interwoven in how we think about modern economies, that how you are economically is reflective of who you are in your soul, in your heart. And so it completely justifies our being able to set up these punitive things, because it actually, you need to get right with God, and then we'll help, or you'll help yourself. God will help you.
Thank you. I see that we are at time. I wanted to truly thank our panelists today, Leslie, Adrian, and Matt. Thank you so much for providing your insights, sharing your work with us, and really showing us how powerful UBI can be in helping alleviate the mental health crisis. To our very active audience participants, thank you so much for submitting questions and having these discussions in the chat. You can feel free to continue the conversation. Head over to Comeau Space, which is our online networking and socialization platform. You can also join us later on for afternoon keynote sessions on the political champions of basic income and dialogue, or our final keynote, Better Together, Reflections on the Movement, Next Steps and Closing Remarks. And before that, we do have a ton of other sessions today that are fantastic, so please do check those out. Again, to our panelists and to our audience, thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope everyone has a fantastic Saturday and happy Juneteenth.
Thanks so much, Monika.
Thank you.
Thank you.